in auditing and assurance, they just end up having to test, they just end up having to test the questions straightforward. They don't give case studies or scenarios, which in this case you have to synthesize and be able to give the answers. So the approach to answer advanced audit might be a bit different to how you'll be able to answer auditing and assurance, but be guaranteed the knowledge for the two units is just similar or one and the same, is relevant to each other. So what you learned in auditing and assurance still relevant to what in this case you are having to advance as you study your advanced auditing and assurance. For example, as I'm having to mention, you realize, for example, this was the sitting for December 2025, the one that just did this previous sitting. If you look at how the questions are formatted, you can see they are case studies, case study kind of. So you're given long stories, then you have to synthesize or look at the case studies and of course be able to utilize them to be able to answer the questions. So you can see how they test advanced auditing. Long stories, you're given long stories, then a question. So the case study kind of questions in advanced auditing and assurance. This is not as to how you got used to having to answer questions in auditing and assurance. So for advanced auditing and assurance, it is very important you understand how can I end up having to break down a question? How can I end up having to utilize the knowledge I have learned in class to be able to answer the questions? You can see all the questions, apart from this question number 5, is where we didn't have like case study kind of question. But you can see all the others. Question 4, case study. There is there. Question 3, case study. Question 2, two case studies, so part A and part B. And of course, also question 1, purely a case study scenario that you've actually been given. So we'll go through question number 1 because it is having to touch on mostly what you've already been able to cover in class, especially for those who are having to take advanced auditing and assurance. Then we can be able to see how you could have actually been able to answer this particular question. So the question is all about Duncan and Duncan Associates. So this is how the question is having to read. So it is saying, you are the audit associate. You are an audit associate at Duncan and Duncan Associates, a firm of certified public accountants responsible for the audit of Long Finger Limited for the year ended 30th of June 2025. You have been temporarily appointed as the audit manager for the audit because the audit manager in charge of the audit traveled abroad. So you are an audit associate who has actually been given a responsibility to be like an audit manager. This means you'll have to in this case guide a team that was actually left by this audit manager. The final audit for the year is nearing completion, and you are reviewing the audit working papers. As part of your duties, you are required to review the progress of the audit with other members of the engagement team. So you, in this case, having the responsibility of reviewing the audit engagement or what is having to happen under the audit engagement, and in this case, the working papers that have already been compiled regarding this particular audit. So during the review, the audit trainee, so there's an audit trainee, expressed the following concerns regarding how the audit was being conducted. So there are a number of issues that have been raised here. So issue number 1, I have only worked on audits before being assigned to the Long Finger Limited engagement. I was expecting to attend a meeting at the start of the audit where the partner and senior team members would discuss the audit plan, but no planning meeting was held. So these are concerns raised by an audit trainee who's part of, in this case, what this engagement. The number 2, during the audit manager was away, leaving the audit associate in charge. The audit associate was busy with other assignment and was not always available to provide guidance. So that's another challenge. This audit associate who has been left, this person here, who has been left by the audit manager, he doesn't even have time because there's a lot on his desk. Number 3, I was given the responsibility for auditing the goodwill arising from an acquisition made during the year. I also worked on the audit of inventory and attended the inventory count, which was complicated due to significant work in progress. Number 4, to assist the client, I helped their staff count some of the raw materials. Later, because I attended the count, the acting audit manager asked me to question the finance director about the adequacy of the provision against the inventory, which he believed was understated. So the acting audit manager asked me 2 questions. So this acting audit manager asked for the questioning of the finance director. Then number 5, as the audit neared completion, we realized we were running short of time. The acting audit manager advised us to reduce the sample sizes in our audit test to save time. He also suggested that if a selected item was time-consuming to verify, we should replace it with another item that would be quicker to audit. So part A of the question is having to call upon us to discuss 3 weaknesses in the conduct of audit of Longfinger Limited and their implications. Part B, identify 2 ethical threats in the audits and recommend how each should have been handled. So threats to the professional code of ethics. Then part C, as the acting audit manager, outline 4 corrective measures you could take to ensure audit quality and compliance with international standards on auditing. The corrective measures. So you need to correct what was there as a weakness. Then part D, with the reference to ISA 260, communication with those charged with governance, enumerate 3 matters that an auditor is required to communicate to those who are charged with governance. So of course, this part D doesn't so much relate to the case study, but part A, part B, and part C is having to relate to the case study. So you have to, in this case, understand what is happening under the case study to be able to adequately answer part A, B, and C. So for example, if you look at the first part here, of course, we've been given a number of scenarios here, but look at the first part here. It is having to call upon us to discuss 3 weaknesses in the conduct of the audit of Longfinger Limited and their implications. You just have, like in this case, an analysis or a look at these 5 scenarios. What do you think you're having to identify as a weakness in this engagement? You must be able to spot something that is out of the expectation, which in this case is having to indicate it is like a weakness when you're having to conduct an audit. What can you be able to spot? You can even use, I can see Nyakeri says familiarity. Lack of planning, very brilliant there from Tracy. There's lack of planning. Of course, you can be able to see it in the first point there. What else can you be able to spot? Lack of planning is a very correct answer. Very correct answer. You'll get marks for that. Lack of audit program. Of course, when you say lack of planning, so under planning, in this case, you have to develop an audit program. Taking part in having to count. Lack of proper supervision. Also, this one is a very correct answer. You see what is happening here? It is lack of planning. Then here, there's no guidance, lack of supervision. Then what else are you having to discover? Of course, I'm having to see an answer from Ken, taking part in count. But taking part in count, that means it will likely end up having to lead to a threat. But before that, delegation. Poor delegation. Yes, there's actually poor delegation. But now you need to at least be able to elaborate. How was this delegation poorly done? How was it poorly done? You have a point there, but just elaborate it a bit. Delegation of duties. There's something you can be able to see here. There's something you can be able to see here. I was given the responsibility for auditing the goodwill arising from an acquisition or made during the year. I also worked on the audit of inventory and attended the inventory count, which was complicated due to significant work in progress. What can you be able to get from here? Which was complicated due to significant work in progress. So what can you be able to get from there? Reducing the sample sizes, but there's something you people are not having in this case to think very fast. Listen to this. During the review, so in this case, the final audit of the year is nearing completion and you're reviewing the audit working papers. As part of your duties, you are required to review the progress of the audit with the other members of the engagement team. So during the review, the audit trainee expressed the following concerns regarding how the audit was having to be conducted. You can see in this case, they're having to engage an audit trainee. An audit trainee. So this point of delegation, you can be able to say, of course, when you say poor delegation, in this case, expound on it and say, The delegation was actually poor because this work was actually left to inexperienced. You can see the audit manager has left an audit associate. Then the audit associate has left what? The audit trainee. This one is someone who doesn't have, like in this case, what? Relevant experience and expertise. Be able to conduct this kind of what? Audits. And then it means there'll be what? There'll be a challenge. There'll actually be a challenge. So we can talk about the first one here. The first weakness that is here is lack of planning. You can see it here. There's lack of planning. Then number two, you can be able to see here, we are talking about what? Lack of supervision. There's lack of supervision. So during the audit manager was away, leaving the audit associate in charge. The audit associate was busy with other assignment and was not always available to provide guidance or supervision of what was having to do what happened. So when you are planning for the audit, in this case, you have to find a way as to how supervision will happen. Like in this case, on each and every day when that engagement is having to be undertaken, there has to be guidance and supervision of what? Of the staffs involved in that kind of what? An engagement. Then of course, also the persons who have actually been left to conduct this kind of an audit are having to deal with what? Complex financial statements. These things of goodwill, very complex. Matters pertaining to group audits, very complex. So they might, in this case, be lacking that expertise to handle these what? Complex what? Audits, complex audits. So assigning a trainee who's just, in this case, newly recruited, he doesn't in this case have like a relevant experience to conduct this kind of audits, which are very complex regarding group structures, where you have to identify how the goodwill was actually valued. So the weakness number three here, you can be able to identify assigning a trainee to audit complex areas such as goodwill and inventory of what? Significant work in progress. So those are the weaknesses that in this case you could have actually been able to identify. And of course, once you expound on them using what is happening under the case, then you could have actually been able to score the marks. For example, in this case, you can talk about what? Lack of an audit plan. So before the audit actually commenced, there was, in this case, no planning that took place, or no initial meeting, or initial meeting that in this case was actually conducted to give guidance as to how the audit will actually be undertaken. So the second point there, we're having to say that this associate or maybe this trainee lacked relevant experience and expertise to conduct an audit on complex operations, such as in this case having to determine goodwill. Determining in this case what? Goodwill. Then lack of adequate supervision. So no guidance was actually provided to the team that was actually involved in the assignments, because the audit manager was actually very busy having to handle what? Other assignments. So then when you talk about ethical threats, which one can you be able to identify? So of course, when you talk about ethical threats, you are talking about what SAF is. So that is self-interest, advocacy, familiarity, intimidation, self-review. Which kind of threats can you be able to identify here? Which kind of threats can you be able to identify? Unable to employ people. I can see the points you are giving. Limited skills, very correct. Limited skills. Incompetency, need of an expert to do what? Conduct an audit on what? Goodwill. So there's self-review. Self-review is actually very predominant. You can see what happened in this point here. To assist the client, I helped their staff count some of the raw materials. Later, because I attended the count, the acting audit manager asked me to question the finance director about the adequacy of the provision against inventory, which he believed was understated. As you can see, this audit trainee here was part and parcel of, in this case, what? Counting the raw materials. It's like they were having to undertake a stock take. Then maybe when he was having, in this case, conducting an audit, maybe it was on field work, he took part in having to count what? The raw materials. This raw materials count is part of what has actually been reported as the closing inventory in the books of accounts of this client. Then he's having to come back again and actually ending up having to do what? Having to question the same inventory, which is in the books of accounts. It's like having to review part of what, in this case, you participated in. Part of what you participated in. So that will end up having to lead to what we refer to as what? What we refer to as self-review threat. Self-review threat. What else? Which other threat? Which other threat can you be able to identify? Familiarity. I can see. Okay, familiarity can be there. Yes, you can be able to say familiarity. Familiarity. How I wish Nyakeri you could be able to expound on that a bit. Familiarity, how is it having to come out? It can be a threat. It can be a threat. Familiarity, how is it having to come out? But you can be able to see self-review is actually very predominant. Very predominant because he took part in inventory check. Then at the same time, he comes back to audit the same inventory. It's like having to review the same work that you've actually been able to conduct. So reviewing the same work you've been able to conduct. This inventory that you took part in having to count is what has been reported as the closing inventory, as the inventory in the books of accounts. So when you come back again to review, then you won't in this case raise questions about it so much because you'll in this case be like reviewing the same work you actually did. You cannot actually end up, it's like having to do an exam, then you mark again for yourself. So it cannot actually end up having to happen. You'll just be reviewing the same work you actually part and parcel of. So that will actually create a threat in terms of what your independence and objectivity to the way you're having to conduct what? The audit. I can see Nyakeri has tried to explain that she's having to say, has worked on two audits before being assigned to Long Finger Limited. But I think these audits seems to be of different. There is not this one is not in relation to Long Finger. Is not in relation to Long Finger. I have only worked on 2 audits before being assigned to Long Finger Limited engagement. I was expecting to attend a meeting at the start of the audit where the partner and the senior team members will discuss the audit plan. So this one doesn't relate to Long Finger, so that one knocks out in Nyakeri your point. It knocks out your point. It knocks out your point. It knocks out your point. There's intimidation to some extent. There's intimidation, which is not exactly having to emanate from the end of the client. It's not having to emanate from the end of the client, but you can see what you are being told here. To assist the client, I helped their staff count some of the raw materials. Later, because I attended the count, the acting audit manager asked me to question the finance director about the adequacy of provision against inventory, which he believed was understated. So it's like in this case, he's having to get a lot of pressure from his audit manager in terms of questioning the finance director. In terms of questioning the finance director. So the way this associate or this trainee will end up having to conduct this audit, it will likely end up having to be as a result of a pressure from his manager here. And therefore, to some extent, we can be able to talk about intimidation, which is exactly not having to emanate from the end of the client, but ideally from within his own firm. In this case, is having to get a lot of pressure regarding as to how he can be able to question the finance director. So we can talk of self-review. Then to some extent also you can be able to talk about intimidation, where the audit manager was having to give him pressure, or was having to call upon him to question the finance director about the adequacy of of the inventory. So you can talk of self-review, then you can talk of also intimidation. You can even talk of advocacy. You see, he took part in this case in having to take count these raw materials. Then you might end up having to find that the raw materials that they ended up having to count, the inventory was not actually correctly reported. So this audit associate or maybe audit trainee who took part in this inventory check, he might find himself in a compromising situation where he might advocate for the position of the client as what was actually reported as the inventory. So the self-review will go hand in hand with advocacy, because he has to advocate that inventory check is correct. He took part of it, and therefore, in any case, any questions are having to be raised. Even this finance director can take advantage of that. To inform him, you have to take note, you are part and parcel of this inventory check. So even if in this case, we're having to say that the value is not correct, then you have to advocate for us. You have to, in this case, indicate the inventory is exactly what's correct. The value of inventory is correct. So they can be self-review because it's part and parcel of the team that did the count, at the same time having to come back and audit the same inventory. At the same time, also, you can talk about advocacy due to the fact that if it happens, the value of this inventory seems not to be correct during the audit, then the client or the finance director here might call upon him to advocate for their position, to defend their position, because the finance director here will end up having to call upon him to remember he was part and parcel of the inventory tech. And therefore, you need to advocate, or need in this case to defend the position of the finance director in terms of what? The inventory tech. So those are part of the ones you can be able to mention. So you can talk about self-review threat. You can talk about that advocacy, then intimidation to some extent, but not exactly directly from the end of the client, but from his end as the audit associate who was having to conduct this audit. So those are the three you can be able to mention. So if you could have been able to mention them here from this point here, then you could have actually been able to score the mark. So remember, the weaknesses, you've been able to identify them from the first three. Then you've been able to identify also in this case, what? The threats to the independence and objectivity, or the threats to the professional code of ethics. So in the exam, they can actually call upon you to indicate the threats to independence and objectivity. They can be very specific, or sometimes they can just be very general like this. Identify two ethical threats. So they haven't talked about independence and objectivity. You have to take note, the answers are the same. The answers are the same. When you talk about threats to the professional code of ethics, the answers are the same, surface. When you talk about threats to independence and objectivity, the answers are the same. So there's no difference. So you won't, in this case, end up having to say the ones for ethical are different from the ones independence and objectivity. They're not different. The answers are just the same. So the five. So the self-review, self-interest, self-review, self-interest, advocacy, familiarity, those ones. Intimidation. So you have to mention those ones to be able to get the marks there. I repeat, where the threats. So we are saying in the exam, the examiner can frame the question like this. State, of course, in the advanced auditing, they won't actually end up having to call upon you to state, but let's assume the question is like this. State the threats to the professional code of ethics. Alternatively, the question could be, state the threats to independence and objectivity of the auditor. The question is like the same, because you'll give similar answers. So like in this case, you can see they have actually indicated what? Ethical threats. Ethical threats. You know, now in this case, as a student, you would be wondering, they would have actually called upon you to indicate what? Threats to independence and objectivity. You might think the answers are different. So what you would state as threats to the professional code of ethics and threats to independence and objectivity would be different. It's not different. State the threats to the professional code of ethics. Alternatively, state the threats to the independence and objectivity of the auditor. So the answers are just the same surface. So hope we are together there. Hope you've been able to get my point. Advocacy threat. Advocacy threat is asking about advocacy threat. So this particular audit associate here, took part in the inventory tech. Took part in the inventory. Then at the same time, he has actually ended up having to come to conduct an audit on this inventory. At that particular point in time, he's having to conduct an audit on this inventory. They realize that the value of inventory is not actually what? Correct. And part and parcel of the parties who have actually been involved in having to mistake this inventory is the finance director. Now that this audit associate took part in the inventory tech, the finance director might end up having to convince him to defend the position of that value of inventory because he was part and parcel of that inventory tech. So the finance director will likely be calling upon him here to advocate, to defend the position of their end in terms of the value of the inventory due to the fact that he was part and parcel. He will tell him, hey, remember, you are part and parcel of this inventory tech. And now there's a misstatement. You have to defend our position. This mistake, you are part and parcel of it. He'll find himself in a compromising situation to defend the position of the client in terms of the inventory tech. Advocacy. Hope we are together. You see now it is having to come out. Hope Damaris, you've seen. You've seen how it is having to come out. Yes. So that is how it is having to come out. So it is, of course, self-review, and of course, advocacy is coming out to some extent. So there's self-review because he's the one who took part. So he's having to review the same work he did. Advocacy because he'll find himself in a compromising situation. To defend the value of inventory, he was part and parcel of having to do what? Tech. So he participated in that. He participated in that. So hope we are together there. So then we can go to part C. Ideally, in this case, now part C, you'll actually just be looking at the solutions to these ones. So what you've been able to set here as the weakness, you indicate what are the solutions. So as the acting audit manager, outline 4 corrective measures you would ensure audit quality and compliance with the international standards on auditing. So like the first weakness we've been able to mention, there was lack of planning. So the corrective measure should be ensure there is adequate planning before commencement of the audit. Adequate planning before the commencement of the audit, where you come up with the audit strategy by identifying the scope, the timing, and direction of the audit. Then at the same time, we've also been able to mention that another weakness was what? The deployment of the staffs to be engaged in this kind of an audit were inexperienced. So ensure you deploy staffs who are highly experienced or have relevant expertise to conduct this kind of an audit. So then ensure that while you're having to conduct this kind of an audit, you do not actually go against what the breaches in terms of the professional code of ethics. So all the ethical requirements in terms of an audit should actually be observed. So we're talking about matters integrity, professionalism, independence and objectivity, those ones. Competence have actually been observed. So then you ensure that after the work has actually been conducted, you're having to review. At the same time, when the work is having to happen, you are ensuring there's actually supervision. So the answers to this one ideally was to heal or to solve the weaknesses that were here. Lack of planning, ensure adequate audit planning before commencement of the audit engagement. Deployment of inexperienced staff, ensure that if you're having to audit complex areas such as evaluation of goodwill or the value of goodwill, ensure the staffs you've actually been able to send out on the engagement have relevant expertise to be able to conduct the audit. Then ensure that you're having to deploy at each and every particular point in time supervision and guidance of the audit staffs who are on this engagement. All relevant reviews are having to be done before you come up with a conclusion and the report for the audit. Then ensure the professional code of ethics have actually been observed to the latter by having to avoid any breach of those professional code of ethics. Key one amongst them having to be independence and objectivity. And of course, all the others having to be observed, like competence, integrity, professionalism, all those ones. So if this one can actually be put in place, then those could end up having to be the corrective measures that can be able to solve part of the challenges or weaknesses that we've been able to identify under this audit. So this part C was in relation to part A. You just solve those weaknesses that we're having to see there. Yeah, so we can go to part D, which is the very final one. It was not exactly directly related to the scenario or the case study, but I wanted you to know what are some of the matters you'll end up having to communicate. Kindly repeat point 3. Repeat point 3. I don't know whether Marceline, you are in the group for the class. I'll share the answer. I'll share the answer in the group. Yeah, so you don't have to worry. We can go to the very final part. With reference to ISA 216, communication with those charged with the governance, enumerate 3 matters that an auditor is required to communicate to those charged with governance. So in an audit engagement, so it is a part of the examples of what you give us an assurance engagement. So there are those elements of an assurance engagement. One of the elements you normally end up having to say that an assurance engagement, it is a 3-party relationship. So who are these parties? So one of them is the auditor. The other party is those charged with the governance. And who is the other party? So of course, you have the auditor or the professional accountant, and those charged with the governance. Then the other party is? Who is the other party? Who is the other party? As I can see, Otieno has already given us the audit scope and timing, significant findings, significant risks and judgments. Yes. Users. So Nyakerians, instead of having to say government, you say users, because users can be many. One of them can be the government, can be investors, can be directors, can be shareholders, intended users. Yes, intended users. Intended users. So these parties who are involved in having in charge of governance, they are the directors, they are the ones who prepare the financial statements. And therefore, there are those matters that during the audit engagement, the auditor normally communicates to them. The auditor normally does what? Communicates to them. So just what we've been actually informed here by Otieno, so that is correct. The scope of the work you're going to conduct, you will communicate to them. So which scope of work in this case are you going to, the scope or the kind of work you're going to be involved in during the audit? Then your audit findings, that is correct. The audit findings is correct. The audit findings is correct. Then if in any case you identify any risks, or for example, breaches in terms of the internal controls and internal control systems, you can also be able to communicate to those charged with the governance so that they can take corrective measures to improve on their internal control systems. So we can talk about what can be communicated as having to be number one, the scope of the audit, the scope and timing of the audit. We can talk about your audit findings. You'll have to communicate them. You can talk about inquiry about the written representations. You'll have to communicate to them to be able to provide. Then you'll also communicate to them matters pertaining to the internal control systems. Any identified weaknesses, you can be able to communicate to them so that by the time, maybe if it happens you're having to come on a repeat audit, they would have actually enhanced or improved their internal control systems or internal procedures, facilitating or supporting the financial reporting process. Supporting the financial reporting process. So we can talk about what can be communicated as having to be number one, the plan, scope, and timing of the audit. Then the call upon by the auditor to the management or those charged with the governance to communicate the key matters, or in this case, the written representations, the audit findings that you've actually been able to come up with, the audit findings or conclusions, any weaknesses that you've identified in the internal control systems can also be communicated so that the management or those charged with the governance can utilize this to be able to improve their internal control systems, the internal control systems that are actually in place. So that is how you could have actually been able to handle this particular question here. So that's just in this case an example as to how they could actually end up having to test some of these questions. I would wish to end there for now, so unless there's any question. So I'll be able to share the answers to what you've just been able to discuss so that you can be able to use it for your own personal revision. But ideally, that is part of what will happen in some of the questions you'll end up having to come across in your upcoming exam. In your upcoming exam. Nikazio Tiano says, kwani hii pepa huwa inamakiwaje? What you are talking about is what I applied on the paper yawa. So I was not actually part and parcel of the team that was having to mark. So I don't know why you could have actually ended up having to fail. But what I can be able to advise you, as you're having to indicate, so the questions for advanced auditing and assurance, most of them are actually case study kind of. So when you're having to give your answers, let's say, for example, you've been called upon to discuss 3 weaknesses. What you need to do, you can use bulletins. You, in this case, use 3 bulletins to give the points. So, or you can use paragraphs. When you're using paragraphs, make sure you use separated paragraphs, 3 separated paragraphs. Then also make sure if you're having to give your answer, the very first point you're having to give is actually the main point. Is the main point. For example, if you say discuss 3 weaknesses, we've already seen what planning was a problem. The first thing that must be seen in your answer 1 is lack of planning. lack of planning was a weakness. Then you can be able to now elaborate on it, how this lack of planning was having to occur or was happening. There was no any initial meeting that was actually conducted before this engagement commenced. So make sure you do that. If you're using still the same case paragraphs, make sure the first point is actually the main point. Because sometimes, students end up having to write long paragraphs. Then the examiner is trying to find an answer in between the paragraph. So it doesn't have that luxury of time to look into those details. Make sure that your very first point is actually the key point. Then if it is having to call upon you to explain, then now you can elaborate further with what other explanations. But the first sentence is very key. The first sentence is actually very key. You can use bulletins or you can use paragraphs. If you use paragraphs, use separated paragraphs. Never mix two answers in one paragraph. You'll score a single mark. If you are to get 2 marks for each point, 1 mark, 1 mark. If you mix 2 points in one paragraph, you'll get 1 mark. These examiners don't have the luxury of time to waste on having to trace your answers. They are marking, someone is marking 100 scripts or 1,000 scripts. So 1,000 scripts. So you just have to be like very strategic as to the way, in this case, you're having to approach the paper. Be very strategic. Be very strategic with the way you're having to do what, approach the paper and give the answers. Give the answers. That's what I can be able to advise for now, Otieno. Do you share a draft report with those charged with governance before the final report? Do you share a draft report? So you don't exactly, in this case, share the report, but of course you can be able to have a discussion regarding what your findings. You can have a discussion regarding your findings before now you do what? You give a final report. So of course you'd have already been able to do your conclusion, because during conclusion, a number of things end up having to happen. So when you're concluding, you're having to evaluate the audit evidence or your audit findings. At the same time, you're having to evaluate other matters pertaining to subsequent events. At the same time, in this case, you're having to evaluate any other matter that might arise, having an impact on the financial statements. So you can just have a discussion regarding your findings. Then in this case, eventually you can now be able to do what? Finalize on your report, which in this case, eventually you'll be able to give once you do the conclusion. Once you do the conclusion. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so see you sometime later. So enjoy your afternoon. Thank you so much for those who have been able to join our session for today. So if you happen to have been joining us for the first time, then the class was having to come to you courtesy of RCM College. You can get connected to our sessions whenever you reach out through to us. We'll be able to assist you to join the classes, Otherwise, asanteni sana. See you sometime later.